Last year I did a video on how to make death's head buttons, and I figured it would be useful to make one about cloth-covered buttons too. I'll do several different examples like I did with the death's head buttons, but these are simpler to make, so it should be a shorter video. Fabric-covered buttons were extremely common in the 18th century. Not only are they relatively quick and easy to make, but they're also very economical, and being covered in the scraps from cutting out the rest of the garment means they'll match it perfectly. Covered buttons were in use long before the 18th century, and you still see them used today, though modern ones are made quite differently. To make them, you will need button molds. Typical 18th century ones were made of wood, bone, or horn, and you can buy reproductions from a number of different websites, which I'll link to in the accompanying blog post. These ones are from Burnley and Trowbridge. However, I found that you can get the wooden ones in a much wider range of sizes from other places. Just search for unfinished wood disc or flat wooden bead on Etsy and you'll find lots of options, usually for a fraction of the price of the reproduction ones. I feel a bit bad about saying that. I'm sorry, historical sewing supply shops. I still love your fabric and thread and books and things, but ouch, those button molds really add up, especially when you need 90 of them for one suit. Multiple different craft suppliers on Etsy carry these 1.5-inch ones, and they're just perfect for those big flat 1780s and 90s coat buttons. They're the same ones I used for the death's head buttons on my black and white coat. Try to make sure you get the ones with the rounded edges instead of the squared ones. On these smaller ones I sometimes find a bit of a bump on the edge, but that's okay, you can just sand it off. These ones are all from Townlet Bead on Etsy and they're fantastic quality and I love them. They took a month to arrive, but it was well worth it. If you've got a stash of modern plastic buttons, those work too as long as they're not a weird shape. Coins might also work, but I wouldn't recommend them unless you're doing small buttons in extremely bulky fabric. In most cases I find they're too thin and too heavy. You will of course need fabric, which is usually scraps from cutting out your garment. Thread. It should be a very strong thread. I like to use this heavy linen for most of mine, but for very small buttons I use finer linen and double it. Heavy silk thread works too if you have any, or heavy-duty polyester, which isn't very historical, but that's okay, I will not judge you for it. Beeswax, because you don't want to sew with linen thread without waxing it. A sharp needle, the right size for your thread. Fabric scissors and paper scissors. Thread snips are good too. Probably a small pair of pliers. And a thimble. Something to mark on fabric with. Heavy paper or something similar to use for a pattern. A pencil, and ideally a compass for drawing circles, though it isn't strictly necessary. Before cutting out your button covers, it's good to have a pattern. Some covered button instructions will tell you to place one mold on your fabric and draw an outline through the hole of a second one, like so, but this is a bit more time consuming and doesn't work with molds that have no holes. I like to make the patterns on stiff paper, with a diameter twice that of the button mold. You may need to make it slightly bigger or smaller than that if your mold is especially thick or your fabric stretches a lot, but mine usually work fine at twice the size. If it doesn't work out after your first button, it's easy to undo it and just try a different size. I'm drawing this with a compass, but if you don't have one, you can use the aforementioned method of rolling one mold around the other and drawing the line through the hole. Or find a round object that's as big across as two molds and trace it. It doesn't matter which side of the fabric you trace your pattern on, since the markings won't be visible on the finished button, but I prefer to trace mine on the right side. The amount of seam allowance I leave varies depending on the size of the mold, but it's better to have it on the smallish side so as not to be too bulky. Cut and wax a length of thread and start folding the edge of the fabric in. After tying off the thread, continue to fold the edge in and do a running stitch all around. This is why I like to trace my line on the right side of the fabric, so I can see it the whole time and know that I'm folding the edge right on the traced line. Once you've gotten all the way back to where you started, pull on the thread to gather up the edges a bit and pop your button mold in there. The one I'm using for this green silk button is very flat on both sides, but many molds have a domed side and a flat side, and which one you want facing outwards depends on what shape of button you're going for. Generally speaking, buttons tend to be more domed in the earlier part of the 18th century and flatter later in the century, but there's a lot of variation, so don't take that as a rule. If you're trying to copy a specific style, it's best to look very closely at your reference pictures before buying molds, to make sure you're getting ones that are the right size and shape. Once your mold is nicely centered in that little fabric bowl, you can pull the gathers very tight so they close up the rest of the way. If you've got big wrinkles that go all the way to the edge and are visible on the presentable side of the button, then your stitches are probably too big, and going back and making them smaller ought to fix this. Take a stitch through one of the bumps on the gathered edge and pull it tightly, and then another across from that, and so on until you've gone back and forth to all the gathers and pulled them in very snug. If at any point you break your thread, dang it, it's okay, just tie off the thread, go around through all the gathers again, and continue, pulling a bit more gently this time. Once all the gathers are pulled in, tie off your thread securely. I like to bury the tail of my thread under the fabric before cutting it off. You may be tempted to leave the thread attached and use it to sew the button on, but don't. If the button ever came off or needed to be moved, then you'd risk having the whole button come apart, so it's much more secure to tie it off now and sew it on with a separate thread. But what if you have a motif that you want to center on your button? I can't see where the middle is with this pattern, but that's easy to fix. Simply trace your button mold right in the middle of your pattern and cut it out, leaving a donut shape. Now you can center the motif and trace around it. This example isn't historical, it's just a factory embroidered scrap I had, but here are some that I painted recently for a 1780s waistcoat. And here are some embroidered ones I made 5 years ago. If your fabric happens to be a very thick felted wool or some similar material that doesn't fray, you might need to cut out the covers with no seam allowance at all, and sew around the edge without folding it in. I suspect this was probably possible on a lot more 18th century fabrics than it is on modern ones. You'll need to put the running stitch a bit further in on the edge, and stitch through a decent sized chunk of material when going back and forth pulling the bumps in. If your fabric is a very bulky material that does fray, that's unfortunate. I've only done covered buttons in such a fabric once, on this ribbed silk waistcoat, and it was not fun. A couple of things that helped were ironing the covers flat right after I'd done the running stitch, to help smooth out the bulk a little bit, and spraying water on the backs after I'd pulled in the gathers. That made it a lot easier to squish all that fabric together tightly. For this example I used a wooden mold, but on my actual waistcoat the buttons are smaller and made with dimes, because all the molds I had were just too thick for such a bulky fabric. They worked pretty well and the buttons are a good size, but much heavier than they should be, which is why coins are usually not a great option. The buttons are sewn on in the same way as the death's head ones. First you anchor your thread to the garment, or to the button, either way works. On this sample I've got a bit of buckram interfacing, and if it were a real coat or waistcoat I'd add the lining after sewing the buttons on. Stitch through the lump on the back of the button, then through the garment, and back and forth a few more times. I usually need pliers for this. You'll need to leave a bit of a gap between the fabric and the button, so don't pull the threads through all the way. Once you've got a good sturdy amount of little thread legs holding your button on, wrap your working thread tightly around them a few times to form a shank. Tie off your thread and cut it, and that's it! If you're sewing it to something already lined, like a breeches waistband, you'll probably want to take more care to hide the thread ends than I did here. But when the lining is added after the buttons, there's no need. For small ones that are very close together, you don't even need to bother cutting the thread in between buttons. Just be sure to tie it off before and after attaching each button so you don't accidentally pull it too tightly and wrinkle up the space between them. Okay, I think that's everything. Source links for all the images I used here are in the accompanying blog post, which is linked in the description. I hope this video was helpful, and I wish you the best of luck on any buttons you may make. I use these on quite a lot of my clothing, and I like them much better than the modern ones that you can get kits for. Thank you for watching. Bye!